Welcome comrades, to this here guide for the chivalrous folk of Bretonnia. This first part is going to be all about the army roster, with the second part being about some builds you can bring, and tactics for Bretonnia to employ. As always, these guides are not about the Bretonnian campaign or meta army builds. So let's get stuck into all the different peasants, knights and birds that we can bring as Bretonnia. So let's begin with their army traits. Of course, Bretonnia has strong cavalry. They've got one for every opponent: light infantry, heavy infantry, enemy cavalries, enemy monsters. They can deal with most of your foes. They're the ones who are going to win the battle for you. Because their infantry, while it is cheap, which means you can bring a lot of it, or put more of your money into the cavalry, the infantry isn't great. The most expensive unit being 700 kind of says it all. The more expensive infantries aren't terrible though, but they won't be winning the battle for you. They need support from the cavalry. But the more cavalry you bring, the more micromanagement is required. This means you have to pay a lot of attention, as there is a higher risk of making mistakes. And then somewhere in the middle they can very easily have air superiority. They've got some great air units with anti-large bonuses, meaning they can take down other air units fairly comfortably, but it is very expensive to do so. They don't have many options in terms of ranged units, whether it's missiles or artillery, but what they do have isn't bad. Their missile units have good range and good damage, but they do lack any armor piercing options, which is quite a big thing. So keep all this in mind when selecting your Bretonnian armies. Now let's take a look at this unit roster. Let's begin with the options for the leaders of our forces. First up is the Lord, a decent general all round with good stats across the board, got some armor, got some damage output abilities, good melee defense so he can stay alive. His weapon strength is pretty high, but it's not armor piercing, so against other heavily armored generals he may not do so well. You can make him armor piercing by putting him on certain mounts, and he has a few basic character abilities and a missile resistance of 15%. So if you're looking to save money on your general because you want to put it elsewhere, the Lord can be a great choice because he's not too bad. Putting him on a mount can make him a bit stronger, but if you're looking to 1v1 those heavily armored enemy generals, he may not be the best choice. If you'd like a wizardy alternative to a melee general, then you may prefer a prophetess. There's 3 different types, each with a different lore of magic: lore of heavens, lore of beasts, and lore of life. Their stats are all identical, it's only the magic that's different. But of course, they are not melee combatants, so they need to try and avoid melee combat as much as possible. They need to be protected, especially from other enemy characters, melee characters. They'll destroy these ladies very quickly, so you've got to try to protect them. A good choice if you want to bring a certain lore of magic, but you don't want to spend loads of money bringing characters with that lore of magic, so you could bring your general and magic caster in one, with the prophetess. And then we have the next option up for your melee generals, Alberic de Bordelot, who is a sword infantry. He's a pretty good melee combatant all round. Pretty similar in stats to the Lord that we covered just now, but his big trait is that he is anti-large, which is an awesome trait for a general to have. So he can be great for taking on monsters or other generals on monsters. You could put him on a horse and travel him around with your cavalry, which will give that cavalry an extra anti-large bonus. And on top of that, he has a pretty good charge bonus, a shield, a bunch of abilities, one of which is plus 16 leadership, which is going to be great for keeping that Bretonnian infantry in the fight. Probably the best choice to bring along if you want to make use of that anti-large bonus that he has. He can of course be put onto mounts to make him even more formidable. Then we have the all-important Fae Enchantress, who is your more expensive wizard option. Again, her melee stats aren't fantastic, she's not meant to be used in melee, but she can kind of go into there a little bit, so she could take on other wizards, or maybe just some lightly armoured troops. She's got a bit more weapon strength, she has magical attacks, and of course she comes with the Lore of Life spellbook, and a few of her own little spells as well. She has resistances to most types of damage, so she can actually be pretty tough, but don't expect her to be knocking out Grimgor Ironhide anytime soon. She also causes fear. So if you're looking to bring the Lore of Life spellbook and you want a general that's a little bit tougher and more robust than the prophetess, then the Fae Enchantress may be a good call. And lastly, a man that needs no introduction, you know who he is, King Luen Leon Kerr. He's an absolute monster in melee and is arguably the best general in the game. He's extremely tough to bring down and can do a fair amount of damage himself, although non-armor piercing damage. He has a bunch of abilities to buff himself and his allies, and a whole ton of resistances. And one of his biggest traits is the Ladies Champion, which gives him health regeneration. Much like a Vampire Lord, this is what makes him so tough to bring down. You can of course put him on various mounts to make him even stronger and give him armor piercing, but he is of course the most expensive general of the bunch. If you don't mind spending the money on him, he can pretty much take on anyone and anything. Hero time. Our first hero, the Paladin. We all know him very well, I'm sure. Good stats overall, but nothing spectacular. He is the cheapest hero you can get, and he's quite reasonably priced. He makes a great bodyguard, taking on other characters, Good for keeping your wizard type safe. He does have non-armor piercing damage though, so you're going to have to be careful of his opponents because he may suffer against heavily armored units. You can of course put him on mounts to make him a little bit stronger, and he's just a good all-round melee hero. And we have another familiar face in the Damsel, who, much like the Prophetesses, there are 3 different types, each with a different law of magic: life, beasts, and heavens. I'm going to go ahead and assume that you understand the laws of magic, and you know which ones are which and what they do. So basically a cheaper version of the Prophetesses. They got their different laws of magic, and then their stats are just telling you not to put them in melee basically. Which one you choose depends on your playstyle and can depend on the faction that you're facing. The life one is obviously a very supporting role, beast is a bit more offensive and a little bit supportive, and then the heavens is kind of a more offensive damage dealing type spellbook. They have a few buffs and resistances, but are basically your typical spellcaster. And lastly of course we have the almighty Green Knight, who, long story short, is a massive tank. He's ethereal, so he negates a lot of damage, and he can cause terror, which is going to be really useful in the late game, and he's also unbreakable, meaning it's impossible to get rid of the bastard unless you kill him, which is no easy feat. While he doesn't have a lot of armor, he does have a shield, and that ethereal trait is going to keep him pretty safe. He's also got magical attacks, so he'll bypass the physical resistances of any units, and his toughness is increased further by his high melee defense. His weapon strength is non-armor piercing though, so he'll be better against lighter targets, and his charge bonus is pretty beastly too. He also comes with a few of his own buffs, one of which is replenishment, so his health is going to regenerate. This again adds to his toughness. He's got the blessing of the lady, which gives him more physical resistance, so his physical resistance is just through the frickin' roof, hence he's a goddamn tank. He'll make short work of lightly armoured units by his damn self if necessary, or can just be great for taking on high-powered lords and heroes. But it does come at quite a high cost at over 2,000, so you've got to make sure you're using him wisely. Prepare your peasants, they are your infantry. Your first infantry, if you can call them that, quite frankly, are useless. Peasant mob don't stick around very long due to their low leadership, and even if they do manage to reach melee combat, they won't do much damage even if they get there. Great for getting in the way and absorbing charges, being a general nuisance, maybe even chasing off some skirmishers. They pretty much play the same role as zombies. And then your first actual infantry that may be of some use, the men-at-arms. They struggle though, as they do have low leadership as well, which makes it very difficult for them to stick around, meaning they're quite unreliable and useless as a front line. Their attack and defense stats aren't actually that bad, so they can kind of do some damage once they get to combat, but they're going to need all the leadership buffs you can give them. This is the only way to really make them of any use. They are classed as an expendable unit on the unit card, so they can play an expendable role as well, but for the price you pay, which is only $250, very cheap, you actually get a pretty good unit. It's only the leadership that's really letting them down. So if you can find a way to keep them in the fight through leadership buffs, they could actually be relatively useful. And then we have Spearmen at Arms. They are the cheapest option of your anti-large spear options. Their melee stats aren't fantastic, but they serve their role as an anti-large unit fairly well. They've got a good amount of melee defense so they can stay in the fight a while, but their leadership is also pretty bad. Probably going to be best used fighting alongside other units, not taking on units by themselves. They are classed as an expendable unit and are pretty cheap, so you could just charge them after some large unit and hope for the best. And then you have the men-at-arms with shields, who, guess what? They're basically the same as the other men-at-arms, they just have a shield. So they're going to be better at avoiding that damage from missiles, which can be useful if you're facing a missile-heavy faction. And having a shield also gives them a buff to their melee defense, which means they'll survive a little bit better in melee combat. So they will be slightly improved in melee combat, not just better at avoiding missile damage. Again, got to keep them buffed with leadership, or they're just going to run away pretty quick. Their leadership is actually about 50, I believe, like all these previous units. It's 50 leadership they have, not 62. I think they're taking a buff from one of the other characters that are standing around near while I'm using them as a prop here, just so you know. And then you've got your Spearmen at Arms with shields. Again, pretty much the same as the previous ones, just they have a shield so they're better against missiles. They have that increased melee defense, so this is going to make them even stronger for dealing with large units especially. While they do have a pretty good amount of melee defense, it's not enough to warrant them being a front line, I think, because their leadership is still really bad. If you're facing a faction with strong large units, you may want to bring these over the regular Spearmen at Arms. And then you have the best option for an anti-large infantry, your men-at-arms with polearms. Very similar to the previous two spear units, just they're slightly better all round. Higher melee defense, only slightly. Their leadership is a bit better as well at 56, but again, they're still going to need the buffs from other units to try and keep them in the game. They don't have shields, however, so gotta watch out for those archers. Their big selling point though is that they are armor piercing, unlike the other two, so against heavily armored cavalries, they're going to do really well. If you're facing a faction that has a lot of heavily armored units coming your way, especially on the flanks, these boys are going to be the ones to take. And then you have your battle pilgrims, who I'm personally quite the fan of. They have frenzy, so the higher their leadership is, the more damage they can do. They've got pretty high leadership anyway, so with buffs they're going to be pretty intense. Their melee attack and defense stats aren't actually that much better than the men-at-arms stats, but their leadership is what makes the difference. Still a pretty good unit though, and your best bet as a frontline infantry. Their frenzy trait can give them an immunity to psychology, but it's dependent on their leadership. They do lack armor however, so try to avoid any unnecessary damage, including missiles, even though they do have a shield. Battle Pilgrims, a pretty strong unit for the price. And then we have your Foot Squires, the armor piercing option for your infantry. A pretty good damage dealing unit, as they do have a bonus versus infantry as well. So these guys will be taking on the top tier heavily armored units of your enemy, whether that be Black Orcs, Chosen, Hammerers. They're not going to win those fights by themselves though. This is what I'm talking about when I say the cavalry needs to help them. If you can get questing knights into the back of whoever they're fighting, that's going to give them the best chance of being able to win that fight against those heavily armoured top tier units. They do have okay armour and good leadership themselves, but like I say, they're not going to beat those units one on one. Foot Squires are essential when facing heavily armoured factions. And lastly, you have the Grail Relique, which besides being a terrifying looking contraption, it's mostly used to support your infantry. Its melee stats are good with a particularly high weapon strength somehow, so against lightly armoured troops it can do a fair amount of damage. But for the amount of time it can spend in combat, it doesn't seem to get very many kills. But its main role within your army is to buff the leadership of nearby units. It gives a plus 16 buff to leadership to any of your nearby units and an immunity to psychology. Going to be pretty essential against units that have a lot of scare tactics. I'm looking at you, vampires. So a nearly essential unit for the front line of Bretonnia to try and help keep their units in the game, especially for those lower leadership units like the men-at-arms and the spearmen. If you're going into a battle quite reliant on your front line, you'll want to bring a Grail Relique along to keep your units in the fight. Missiles. Peasant Bowmen, a unit we already kinda know, very much your typical archer unit. They of course suck in melee, but as far as archers go, they're pretty good. They've got a decent amount of range, only second to the elves of course. Their missile damage is pretty good as well. But they do lack armour, so having skirmish fights with other archers can be a risky business. So that's your standard Peasant Bowman. And then there's also a fire arrow version, who are pretty much the same as the previous Peasant Bowman, just they have fire attached to their arrows. So it means they do a little bit more damage, and they're going to be a bit more use against regenerating units and things that are weak to fire. Tree units as well, of the elves. But against everything else, it's still going to do some extra damage. And then you have Pox arrow versions of Peasant Bowmen, who just cause poison, who are going to do all the typical poison effects that any other poison unit will do. Going to be great for slowing down enemy units or weakening them before they fight one of your other units perhaps. And then we have a Missile Cavalry, who I'll include in this section as they are a lone unit. Mounted Yeoman Archers, pretty much your run-of-the-mill Missile Cavalry. Great for harassing the enemy and causing them some problems, giving them something they can't really catch because they're so fast, and they have Vanguard deployment. They can do a bit of damage against lightly armoured factions, but generally don't have a great deal of damage output. They can't really do melee, but they could perhaps chase off some skirmishers or take out artilleries. Great for harassing and giving the enemy something to think about, but that's about it. The almighty Bretonnian Cavalries. First up, the Mounted Yeoman, a very basic melee cavalry. Nothing too special, but they are very fast and have Vanguard deployment, so they are perfect for chasing down unprotected skirmishers and artilleries. Their melee stats are enough to destroy those types of units or other lightly armoured fast cavalries. And then there's the Knights Errant, who are basically a poor man's shock cavalry. They're armoured and shielded, so they can stay relatively safe from missiles and such, but as a shock cavalry, they are of course not meant to stay in prolonged combat. They only have 22 melee defense, which is not very high at all. And their melee stats and charge bonus aren't bad, but they're not going to be dealing out a ton of damage. Going to be great for running into those lightly armoured troops, but heavier troops won't be in too much danger from them. They do have this lance formation, which can give them some damage bonuses, but you'll basically want to bring them along against lighter factions. Heavier factions like the Chaos or the Dwarves aren't really going to feel too much damage from these boys, so if you're facing a lighter faction or you're just trying to save money, bring along the Knights Errant. Next is the Knights of the Realm, who are another shock cavalry. They're basically a slightly better version of the Knights Errant, and they are anti-large. But I find they can have kind of a multiple role. They can go after lighter infantries like the Knights Errant, but they could also go after monsters or other cavalries. But again, they're a shock cavalry, so charge them in, pull them away, don't leave them there, or they will get absolutely hammered. If you were going to bring the Knights Errant but you think a bonus versus large might be useful, Knights of the Realm might be the way to go. Now for the Questing Knights, these are one of the stronger cavalries for the Bretonnians. Their selling point is that they're a melee cavalry and they are armor piercing. So these are the guys that are going to help you take down the Black Orcs or Chaos Warriors or any dwarf. You You can charge them in and leave them there and they will go to work as they are a melee cavalry. Their stats are great all across the board, lots of damage output, pretty good melee defense, an okay charge bonus, and really high leadership. Questing knights are an essential part of any army against heavily armoured troops. That includes heavily armoured enemy cavalries. Then for your elite shock cavalry, it's of course the Grail Knights. A very strong cavalry with the Living Saints trait. What this does for them, it gives them some physical resistances, immunity to psychology, and also an immunity to vigour, so they won't get tired. The Grail Knights have great stats all across the board, with a standout one being their massive charge bonus. 82, going to deal tons of damage to anything they hit, not just large units because they are anti-large. I like to think of the Knights of the Realm and the Grail Knights as pretty much the same unit, as they serve the same purpose within the army. When deciding which to bring, I'll ask myself, do I need a fantastic shock cavalry, or can I get by with an okay one? Am I facing a faction with a lot of strong monsters and large units? Which one do I need to bring? If the answer is I need a better one, then I'll bring the Grail Knights, as they are of course the stronger unit. They have the Lance formation, which can help give their charges a bit of extra punch. They also have magical attacks, which I believe ties into the Living Saints trait. If you're into your hammer and anvil tactics, it doesn't come much better than the Grail Knights. And last but by no means least, we have the Grail Guardians, who are a melee cavalry, so they're the ones that are designed to stay in combat. I know I keep saying that, but a lot of people don't seem to ever realise it. They've got a ton of armour, a shield, ridiculous leadership. They're living saints just like the Grail Knights. Their damage output isn't fantastic, but their melee defense is huge, so they're great survivors. Good for taking on other cavalries as long as they don't have an anti-large bonus. Great for slicing through lightly armoured units because they're not armour piercing. There aren't very many melee cavalries in the game, let alone good ones, so they have that advantage. Slam them into the back of infantry or into other cavalries, and they'll be able to chop through them pretty comfortably. Your feathery flying cavalries. The first of our flying units, the Pegasus Knights, of course are flying cavalry. Their selling point besides being flying is that they are anti-large. They can dish out a fair amount of damage, but they don't have a great deal of melee defense, so you have to be kind of careful with them. They're probably best served being used like a shock cavalry, charging them in and pulling them away, not leaving them there, against cavalries and monsters or units that are engaged elsewhere. Like all flying units, there's many useful things that they can be doing. They can of course help you hold air superiority, provided that you look after them and try to keep them from taking too much unnecessary damage. And then you have Royal Pegasus Knights, who are pretty much the same as the previous Pegasus Knights, just a little bit tougher and better all round. They have their Living Saints trait, so they're going to get those extra buffs to resistance and to vigour. But like I say, they play pretty much the same role as Pegasus Knights, just they're better at doing it. They have magical attacks, so they can increase their damage a little bit, and their melee defense is slightly higher, so they can hang in combat a little bit more. You'll probably want to go for the Royal version against factions with tough monsters or cavalry. Can also be great for challenging generals on large flying mounts. And lastly, we have the Royal Hippogriff Knights, who are pretty frickin' awesome looking, if nothing else, like many of the Bretonnian units. They have an okay amount of armour, but no shield, so you have to watch out for those skirmishers as they may take them down quick time. They have a pretty good damage output though, their weapon strength is really high, and it's armour piercing. So these fellas are going to be great for taking on top tier heavily armoured units. Mainly infantries though, as they don't have an anti-large trait, so Black Orcs, Chosen, Great Swords. All these flying cavalries do have pretty good charge bonuses, so using them as a shock cavalry may be a better idea, as again, these ones don't have a fantastic amount of melee defense, so gotta be careful because they are very expensive. Artillery. Artillery, the classic of the trebuchet of course, is the Bretonnians' weapon of choice. All that really matters is its range and its missile damage, both of which are pretty damn good. The missile damage is armor piercing as well, so maybe better off firing at those heavily armored units for that extra damage. And then there is also a blessed field trebuchet, which is pretty much the same deal, just it has magical attacks, so going to be great for those ethereal units or units with physical resistances, and just does more damage overall. Which one you should bring depends on which faction you're facing. If they have a lot of physical resistances, then the blessed trebuchet may be the best choice. And that concludes the first part of this Bretonnian army guide. In the second part we'll look at some of the builds and the tactics and the things you need to think about when using Bretonnia on the battlefield. Thank you kindly for watching, and I'll leave you with the army selection screen where you can check out the costs of the units if you so wish.